Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Cardano and its native token ADA, Dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I wanted to check in with Cardano. It has been an interesting few weeks. We will sort of recap what we were talking about previously and see where we are now. So one of the last times we spoke about ADA, we might have made a video between this past video and the current one. But one of the things that we were talking about was this outcome here. This was back when ADA was at $1.20. I noted that 120 was likely going to provide some resistance, plus or minus 10 cents or so. I think technically ADA went to around 130, but we were looking at this pattern, right, where we're putting in these higher highs, we're also putting in these higher lows, right? You're getting this expanding, broadening wedge, and the outlook that we talked about was ADA dropping back down here at the very least, right? And the reason we said that, two reasons. Reason number one, that's what happened last year. That's what happened the year before. If it's not broke, don't fix it, right? Maybe that time's not different. And it turns out it hasn't been. Reason number two is that if you look at what happened in 2020 going into early 2021, there was also a drop down to the prior highs. You see that? Now the question is, of course, what's going to happen next? So let's take a look at the chart. Okay, so back then when ADA was $1.20, we said, look, there's a good chance it's going to drop back down and come below the prior high. All right, now let's see if in fact it did that. If you look here at this wick, it did in fact come back below the prior high. So it's one of those things where, when you put out the video, it takes a while for those things to play out. But if you're patient, right, a lot of times these patterns do play out. Even though it doesn't feel like they are in the moment, a lot of times they do. And once again, you can see that this pattern has repeated itself of another slightly higher high, and the expanding, broadening wedge continues. We had one of these last cycle too, although it didn't last nearly as long. Right? It didn't last nearly as long. Now, technically speaking, if you look at Forex markets, I believe if you go through the statistics, rising, broadening wedges will break down slightly more often than they will break up, right? So there are times where they break down before they break up. And actually, last cycle, you can see that's what happened, right? You actually saw ADA break down before it broke up. Now, you could argue that it sort of broke down a little bit right there, but the reality is that ADA has been stuck in this rising, broadening wedge for several years now. And so one of the things that we talked about was that one potential outcome, right? One potential outcome, and we talked about this back when ADA was at $1.20. If you guys remember back in 2021, $1.20 was where ADA spent a lot of its time. One of the things we mentioned was that you're likely going to see a pullback back below the prior high. Now, I didn't pull that out of thin air, right? It is dubious speculation, don't get me wrong, but it was basically just saying, well, what happened last year? And you can see that last year it basically went just below the prior yearly high. You see that? And if you go to the cycle before, one of the things you'll notice is that this higher high had a pullback down here, right? Below the prior high. So what I'm suggesting right now is that we have seen more of the same. And actually, when you look at this on a daily time frame, one of the things you'll notice, and I was actually pointing this out on ITC Premium at the time when ADA rallied back up here to over $1.10, I said that it's likely a repeat of what happened right here. And what's interesting is it happened at the exact same time, more or less. Okay, so this spike by ADA USD last year was about January 10th or so. This spike was January 7th. And you can see that it was, in fact, a lower high as compared to the first top for the year. You see that? And so if this continues to play out the same way, which there is no guarantee, right? There is no guarantee. It's still possible that ADA USD, sort of sweeps these lows over here, right? Now, of course, that's considering if the pattern just repeats itself. You know what I really think is happening? And again, no one knows what's going to happen. So if you're looking for me to tell you what's going to happen, I'm going to disappoint you because I don't know. But I'll tell you what I think is happening right now. What I think is happening with ADA is we are chasing two narratives, okay? And basically it goes something like this, right? At the, in Q4, early Q1, ADA bounces, right? It bounces. And it wants a reason, to break out of this wedge, but it keeps not getting it. It keeps not getting it. And you could argue that the reason it hasn't had that opportunity to break out of the wedge is because quantitative easing has not started. Now, again, that's dubious speculation. There does exist a scenario where ADA breaks out of the wedge before QE starts. But if you just simply look at last cycle, let's go back to the weekly time frame so we can zoom out a little bit more. If you just simply look at last cycle, ADA did not break out of that wedge here until after the Fed turned on the money printer. And the Fed did not turn on the money printer until September of 2019. Okay? So what you'll notice is that ADA actually dropped, and then the money printer came on. It dropped some more, and then you got a recession, and then it went up. You see that? That's essentially what happened. So what I think is happening with ADA and why there's these major shifts in sentiment from it's it's going to the moon one week, and then the next week, all hell's breaking loose. I think what's happening is ADA is coming up to these highs and trying to find a reason to break out. But every time it gets there, it keeps not getting the reason because QE still hasn't happened yet. And that might be exactly what's going on. And then the same thing could be said over here, right? It keeps coming back down to these lows, but it keeps not really breaking down in any durable way. Why? Because there's still not a recession, right? But it's an interesting mix, right? It's an interesting mix because on one hand, in order to get QE, you need the markets to be weak, right? And last cycle, it took QE for ADA to break out. It doesn't necessarily have to happen. I mean, maybe rate cuts could be good enough, but that's what has been happening, right? And so every time we get to one extreme, it feels like we're never going to go to the other extreme because all we can think about at the time is, things look great. But I think the issue is that every time ADA gets up here and the economy's doing okay, then all of a sudden ADA's like, well, if the economy's doing okay and the money printer isn't coming back on, does it have enough juice to really break out? Right? And that's the question that it keeps having to ask itself. And then it gets down here and it's like, well, does it really want to break down now? It looks around and says, well, initial claims are 200K, right? The unemployment rate's at 4.1% or something. Where's that recession? And then it goes back up. So we basically see the same thing. And what's interesting is the pattern this cycle has been repeating longer, right? I mean, last cycle, it was only one time. It was just this one time. You had a higher high, you had a drop, right? Same thing here. And then you had this drop. And I remember last year when we had this double high, and I was debating internally with myself. I'm like, well, didn't we already have this? But I didn't believe it. And the reason I didn't believe that we were going to break out was because ADA Bitcoin did not look like it had bottomed. Okay? If you go look at ADA Bitcoin in 2019, it looked like it had found a bottom, right? And that was one of the reasons I was so bullish on ADA back in 2019, right? It looked like it was finding support at 400 Satoshis. Remember? And so because of that move in 2019 by ADA Bitcoin, because it was finding support at 400 sats over and over and over and over again, when I looked at the chart, it made sense to assume that it would eventually break out and go to new all-time highs. Because not every altcoin goes to new all-time highs every cycle. There are actually a lot of alts that become relics and they don't see new all-time highs. So what you look for is the support holding on the alt Bitcoin pair. And that's what gives you the confidence to say new all-time highs can come. At least that's what gave me the confidence last cycle to think that ADA could go to a new all-time high. So that, I think, last year is what really made me kind of have to sort of separate myself a little bit from it, because I know I made a lot of people in the Cardano community upset by saying it would go back down and by saying it would go to 400 sats. But you always have to remember that, first of all, just because I believe something, right? I mean, if I think something's going to happen, it's not necessarily what I want to happen. It's just what I think is probably going to happen. And I think as a community, it would make a lot more sense when people provide opinions about the markets, rather than like beat them down over their opinions, just take it for what it's worth, recognize they could be wrong, recognize that everyone is wrong, and no one has a crystal ball. No one knows what's going to happen, right? I mean, an asteroid could hit, and then everything changes, right? Or the Fed can print $10 trillion and everything changes. Okay, so let's kind of get beyond the idea that any one person knows what's going to happen. No one actually knows. So that was what happened last year for me, as I was looking at this. I was like, I know we already had sort of that double top there, kind of like we had in 2019. And so you could argue that it was going to break up, but I really didn't think it was going to. And in March of 2024, when Bitcoin put in a mid-cycle top, when gold broke out and USDT dominance hit its long-term trend line, it made sense to assume that was a mid-cycle top for Bitcoin. And it made sense to assume that alt USD pairs would bleed and that alt Bitcoin pairs would bleed as well. And so when you look at ADA Bitcoin, you can see that's essentially what happened, right? ADA USD in 2023 was not that much lower than 2024. It really wasn't a big change, right? You're talking the difference between 25 cents and like 27 cents. Not a huge difference. But what did change was the ADA Bitcoin valuation, right? In 2023, ADA was like 800 and 900 sats, but here in 2024, it was like 400 to 500 sats. And so that is what you look for. Now, this is where I'm struggling a little bit. Okay, I'm just trying to be honest. It's where I'm struggling a little bit. Normally, in post-halving years, Bitcoin dominance goes down and alt Bitcoin pairs go up. As of this point, we have not yet seen QE resume, right? And if you look at the balance sheet of the Fed, one of the things you'll notice is that last cycle, ADA Bitcoin didn't even bottom until QE began, right? That's when it bottomed. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's not a scenario where ADA Bitcoin hasn't already bottomed. Certainly there has. I mean, it went close to 400 sats. It went to 470 sats. And of course, the critics will nickel and dime me on every single Satoshi. Most of them probably said it would never go below 2,000 sats to begin with. But it did go to 470 sats. But the counterpoint, of course, is that how do we know that's the bottom? It's not a double bottom. Not that you have to have a double bottom. It's not like this over here showed a double bottom before it had a massive rally. So I don't want to suggest that it has to, but it still does look a lot different than what it looked like in 2019. But again, even ETH Bitcoin in 2016 didn't double bottom, right? It just put in a low and then it took off. So I don't want to suggest that it has to go back down, but I do want to at least highlight the fact that last cycle, ADA Bitcoin did not bottom until QE began, or just before QE began. Will QE begin or not? And I think that's what altcoins are trying to figure out. The counterpoint, by the way, to alt Bitcoin pairs going up in 2025 is that in the short term is that they could still go up in 2025, but that doesn't mean they have to immediately. If you look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, you'll notice that they tend to come back down to the range lows, just like they eventually go to the range highs. But what's interesting is that in October and almost November of 2017, all Bitcoin pairs were at their range lows. Even in October of 2017, October, the week of October 30th, they were at their range lows going into November. So you could have a scenario, believe it or not, where alt Bitcoin pairs still go lower later this year, but they still go up in 2025. Because when alt season happens, right, when you get major alt moves, it can happen in like 2 or 3 weeks, right? So, and again, I've talked about this, right? Like there's this idea that a lot of people had going into 2025 that it was going to play out exactly like 2021, where altcoins just take off. But in reality, we're not seeing that right now. And one of the reasons we're not seeing it, potentially, is because we haven't seen the Fed sufficiently pivot from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. They've cut rates some, but they have not yet pivoted. And I think that is sort of the conundrum that a lot of the altcoins face. And if you guys notice this wedge, this expanding, broadening wedge that we've talked about, alt Bitcoin pairs look like the same thing, right? Look at it. Look closely. Starting in 2023, it's a little bit different, right? It's a little bit different, but it's a similar idea, right? Over here, you have higher highs and higher lows. For alt Bitcoin pairs, you have higher highs and lower lows. But what's essentially happening is that the altcoin market is chasing the narrative, right? It's Bitcoin season to alt season, to Bitcoin season to alt season, Bitcoin season to alt season, and it just keeps going back and forth. And so what ends up happening is the people who won alt season keep getting disappointed. And one of the arguments that maybe it hasn't happened is because they never went to the range lows. There are cases where individual altcoins don't go to the range lows on their Bitcoin pairs, but I would argue that could be detrimental. ADA Bitcoin is already pretty close to its range low, but the collective altcoin market did not make it close to the range low. There are times when an altcoin does not go to its range low, but the issue with that, right? And again, here's a good example, is to look at XRP Bitcoin, right? A good example of this is to say, like last cycle, if you look at it in this way and you say that XRP Bitcoin range low is, say, down here, there are times when the altcoin market or an altcoin does not go to the range low and it puts in a higher low. The issue is if it does that, it might not make it back up to the range high. You see that? So, it's one of those things where, like, you might not want it to happen, but if it doesn't happen, it might mean you don't go to the range highs, like XRP Bitcoin wasn't able to do last cycle. And so when you think about like the altcoin market, because Bitcoin dominance already hit 60%, I don't really think it makes a ton of sense to be so deterministic about alt Bitcoin pairs. And I said that back when dominance hit 60% and before ADA had its rally, right? But at the same time, there is part of me that thinks that you would actually get a bigger rally by alt Bitcoin pairs if they came down here first, right? So imagine if alt Bitcoin pairs do what they did last year, where they put in this top right there, they go down, they get a slightly lower high, and then they drop again. If you were to see something like this, then you'd be more likely to get a big rally up to the range highs, right? That's what everyone wants. The hard part is if you don't go down here, it makes it a lot harder to come up here. It doesn't mean you can't come back to this level, or maybe even this level, but it might be a lot harder to get back up here if alt Bitcoin pairs don't come down there first. Now, again, if you look at ADA Bitcoin, it already made it a lot of the way there. And I don't really know if it's worth nickel and diming ADA over the difference between 400 sats and 470 sats, right? But I will say that there is a chance that ADA Bitcoin is just simply repeating what it did last year, right? Where the volatility is just increasing as we get later on in the cycle, where it gets this big move up, it comes back down, bounces off the bull market support band, and then eventually fades below it. there is a chance that it happens again. There's also a way that it doesn't happen, right? If QE can come back, if quantitative easing can come back, then there's a chance that ADA Bitcoin could simply find support at its bull market support band and try to turn this into a constructive trend. But the issue that I see right now is that we haven't actually gotten quantitative easing just yet. So there's no guarantee, regardless, right? There's no guarantee, but especially there's no guarantee because QE has not yet started that ADA will even hold the bull market support band as support against Bitcoin. Now, there is an FOMC coming up relatively soon. It's going to be January 29th. So keep an eye on that. The Bank of Japan will also be meeting as well. So that will be interesting to watch and to see the outcomes there. But I think the reason that, you're seeing, and it's not just ADA, it's a lot of altcoins, the reason you kind of see this weakness by them on their Bitcoin pairs potentially is just because Bitcoin, or is because the Fed never pivoted from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. Now, I mean, it's true that dominance normally goes down in post-halving years, but it's also true that alt Bitcoin pairs were at 0.25 as late as October, early November of 2017, and then they still skyrocketed over the next 2 months, right? So you could still have a scenario where alt Bitcoin pairs do go down, and then they still go up at the end of 2025, going into early 2026. A lot of people have made the comparisons between 2016, 2017 to 2024, potentially 2025. But remember, in 2017, alt Bitcoin pairs didn't really take off in any durable fashion until the end of the year. Okay? So, as far as ADA USD goes, I think the thing to consider is that if it's just kind of in this area right here where it's getting some wicks up, but it's not really going anywhere, if it is to come back down, you might see it come back down to these lows that it put in. That's exactly what it did last year. And when it did that, it actually corresponded to Bitcoin testing its own 100-day moving average, right? So if you go look at Bitcoin's 100-day moving average, you can see that last year it tagged the 100-day moving average. I don't know that it necessarily has to, but if you look last year, you can see that's exactly what Bitcoin did, right? There was a range low. It eventually broke below it, tagged the 100-day SMA in late January. Now, if you look at late January for ADA last year, so January of 2024, but the end of January, that's exactly where ADA came back down and then put in a slightly lower low beneath that wick low. So if you're trying to compare it to this year, this wick low right there corresponds to that one, and then this sort of lower high corresponds to this one right here, okay? And the narrative that could support such a move could just be the 10-year yield continuing to go up. Remember, as long as the 10-year goes up, it's a headwind for risk assets. And you could argue that whenever the 10-year tops, risk assets could find a bid again. The issue is that there does exist a scenario where the 10-year tops for a very bad reason. Let's hope that's not the case. If it tops for a bad reason, then you could see the long end come down and risk assets go down with the long end of the yield curve. But if it tops because initial claims just start to go up, which is going to happen, more than likely, because if you look at initial claims, they've been dropping like a rock, which is why the long end's rallying. That's why the dollar's rallying. But you can also see it was also dropping this time last year, and then it started to go back up. And so if initial claims start to trend back up, which is what I'm guessing they're going to do as we get further out into this quarter, you'll likely see the DXY cool off. You'll likely see the long end of the yield curve cool off. I think the dollar and the long end of the yield curve will top in Q1 of 2025. That is my base case. Okay, Q1 of 2025, I think those two things will top: the dollar, DXY, and the 10-year yield. And one of the things to look for as it relates to the 10-year yield, you guys thought I was going to be talking about ADA, but I tricked you. When you look at the 10-year yield, one of the things to remember is that a lot of times it'll sort of sweep a prior high. I know it's dubious speculation, but that's the title of the video. If you look at the RSI for the 10-year yield, you'll notice that it's been putting in these lower highs. So if and when the 10-year yield tags this lower high there, that could be the top for the 10-year yield whenever that occurs, and it might just be sweeping this prior high. Remember, when the 10-year yield topped right there, the S&P found a bottom. And if the S&P is dropping, typically crypto is dropping as well. So that's what I think makes sense to think about right now with ADA. Now, the question is if the 10-year yield does top and then ADA does bounce, does it actually lead to a higher high? And if it does, the more important question is, does it actually break through? I think the answer to that is going to still be dependent on what the Fed does. Okay. A lot of people would like to see QE come back. It keeps not coming back. The altcoins sort of get on deck in hopes that it breaks, in hopes that QE comes back. Doesn't, they come back down, right? Same thing again. Hey, let's hope that QE comes back. Oh, it doesn't. Altcoin season's over, right? It never really started. Come back down. Same thing's happening again, right? They're on deck. They're hoping to break out. QE still isn't here yet. They're, the sort of the buyers are still hoping, right? But if it still doesn't come back by the time that, especially if it gets back up there, then you could see the same thing again, right? Where it just sells off again. And I mean, look, that's not necessarily what people want to see, but there does exist a scenario where that happens. Okay. So, those are my thoughts on ADA. Now, one of the things I want to mention to you guys, if you're not familiar with this website, is we have a lot of different tools that you can use. And obviously, I do most of my videos on Bitcoin. But if you are interested in an altcoin, you can click on the asset filter. And let's say you're interested in Cardano, you can click on that. And then all these charts that come up, the thumbnail is not for ADA, but if you click on them, it'll automatically take you to ADA, right? So in this case, you're looking at ADA dominance. Not really a great chart to look at. If we're being honest, don't take it up with me. Take it up with the data, right? If you want to do something about it, that's up to you. Don't get mad at me. What you can see, though, is that ADA dominance bottomed here at around the same level that it bottomed back over here, right? So maybe that's sort of a good counterpoint for ADA Bitcoin, is that dominance for it bottomed around the same level, at least so far. But you can also look at a lot of other things, right? You can look at the risk level for Cardano and see that it's currently at 0.5964, right? This over here, right, this rally over here by ADA USD took it up to around 0.667 risk or so. If you look at it over here, it took it up to around that same level, okay? So again, there's a chance that we're just kind of in this zone right here. The question is do you actually get that move? And that's what people really want to know, right? Do you get that move? If you get that move, then ADA Bitcoin likely goes up. If you don't get that move and it just bleeds again for the third year in a row, that's how you would see ADA Bitcoin just go down again. And obviously that would be very, a very difficult thing for Cardano and obviously for the for the holders of it to sort of see it bleed back down again. But it is, again, it's all about managing your risk, trying to see where, what are the most common patterns, and what could theoretically happen. This, right, looks kind of like that. And then this looks a little bit like that. Counterpoint is we never got this, right, the landing. We had an inverted yield curve in 2019, and then we got a landing in 2020. We had an inverted yield curve in 2023 and 2024. Do we get a landing, right? You could always get a quick move down followed by a big rally up, especially if Bitcoin were to get a larger sell-off. Now, I think the base case for Bitcoin is that it's just maybe doing what it did last January, right, where it had a big move up in October, November, and then just consolidated for a couple of months, right? So I think you could argue that that's what's happening right now. But there's always a chance that you get a deeper sell-off if the S&P continues to sell off. And if you do, and it tags this trend line, that would be a big drop for ADA. But if it does, then I imagine QE would come back, and then ADA Bitcoin might finally get a big move up. But again, if you look at some of the other charts for Cardano, you can also look at like the running 1-year ROI. It's been generally positive since November of 2023. If you were to look at the year-to-date ROI of ADA, we can look at it in 2025 and compare it to 2021. Pretty different, right? And you can see that 2025 is a lot different than 2021. In 2021, you had Altseason immediately. 2025, that's not what's happening so far. So certainly something to consider there as well. If you look at the ROI from the low for Cardano in cycle 2 and cycle 3, this is what it looks like so far, right? And so last cycle, you can kind of see like some similarities in kind of the qualitative part of the chart, but then it sort of just trailed off, right? Eventually over here it did. If you measure it from December 2018, obviously it would have lasted a lot longer, but this is measuring it from the March low, because that's when ADA put in a lower low. You can also measure it from the peak. So go from peak to peak for ADA and see where we are right now, right? So this is ADA USD, comparing cycle 2 to cycle 3 peak. Kind of this, it's similar, right? There are similar parts about it. Even though it doesn't look identical, there are some similarities associated with it. But anyways, guys, those are my general thoughts on ADA, and kind of what I'm thinking here in the short term. My guess is in the short term, it still might show some weakness down here. Obviously, if you get a really bad data point, like the unemployment rate skyrockets or the inflation skyrockets, you would likely get a larger sell-off by ADA. But as long as that doesn't happen, then there's still a decent chance that it's just repeating, essentially what it did the last couple of years, right? Where it puts in a top and then goes down here, puts in a higher high. Same thing, right? A top sets sort of a higher low and then a higher high. Same thing, a top setting a low down here. If it goes up and puts in a higher high again, the question is will it break through? My guess is this. It's all an if then. If QE comes back, and if inflation and unemployment rate do not go up substantially, then it's a higher likelihood it breaks out. If QE does not return, and or the unemployment rate and or inflation starts to break back up, then you might just get a repeat of what happened last year and the year before. So I think it depends on what happens over there, right? And is there a justification for QE? One way that you could get QE is if the stock market sells off. And the only evidence I have for it, because normally you don't really fade the stock market. It's better to just be a macro bull than to be a bear. But if you do look at the stock market divided by the money supply, the S&P actually found resistance at this same level in 1998, had a big drop, and then had a massive move higher. If the S&P had a drop like that, where it dropped down here or even down here, you have to imagine the money printer would come back on. And if the money printer came back on, then alt Bitcoin pairs, alts, would likely outperform Bitcoin as the S&P maybe comes back up here. And that's how you could get that rotation from the blue chips to the altcoins. Now, some of you guys are probably like, well, Cardano, you think Cardano is a blue chip, but that is not my opinion, okay? And I know that makes some people upset, but hopefully we're at the point where we can respect other people's opinions. If you think it's a blue chip, I can respect your opinion. It's just my opinion that, Bitcoin is essentially in a league of its own. And if you have been navigating this cycle for the last few years, you probably know what I'm talking about. Even for the people that sort of labeled ADA a blue chip a few years ago, after you watch it bleed against Bitcoin for this long, how do you call it that, right? If we're being honest, right? How do you call it that if it can just bleed against Bitcoin? It's not a knock against ADA. It's every other altcoin does the same thing. It's just an acknowledgement of, hey, there are times in the cycle where ADA goes up against Bitcoin, and there are times in the cycle where it goes down. And rather than fight that trend, just accept it, right? Just accept it and invest accordingly. But those are my thoughts. That's some dubious speculation for you about Cardano and its native token ADA. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. But again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.